Hello again, and thanks for joining us for this New Year's Eve edition of Alaska Weather, Saturday, December 31st, 2022. Up first here, we've got hazardous weather graphic. Out in the Bering Strait there, St. Lawrence Island, the Bering Strait coast. That's a winter weather advisory out for tonight and through 3 p.m. Sunday afternoon for gusty winds 35 to 45 miles an hour with kicking up areas of blowing snow and reducing visibilities there. And again, that's out through tonight and tomorrow morning. Really nothing that isn't too typical for this time of the year going on out there. And then winter weather advisory is also out for the Susitna Valley, Matanuska Valley, Kenai Peninsula, Copper River Basin, Western Prince William Sound, and that's for rain, snow, and possible freezing rain, and gusty winds coming in with the next system tonight through tomorrow. And then winter weather advisory, or snow advisories actually, for the northern panhandle areas. Juneau, roughly about Juneau northward, could include maybe Petersburg, and probably not Wrangell though. But those areas could see a few inches of wet snow here tonight and tomorrow. Moving on to satellite imagery, you can see the next system coming up from the south there, starting to the cloud shield making landfall on the east side of Kodiak Island early this afternoon, about 2 p.m., and also thickening clouds pushing into the southeast coast now. Otherwise, over the interior, not too bad, kind of some showers across the Kenai Peninsula into the southwest interior areas, and some loose clouds up over portions of the interior of the state. And also some cloudiness up along the Arctic coast, moving from west-southwest to north-northeast there. And then out over the Bering Sea, also nothing too well organized as far as the clouds go. Just some areas of snow showers, rain and snow showers there. Not too bad for the Adak-Atka area, again into the Fox Islands, especially Unimak Island. May have seen some clearing this afternoon during the day today. And on the chart, there's that next system, and starting to increase the wind and precipitation Kodiak Island late this afternoon after a break earlier today, and eventually up to the North Gulf Coast there with the Panhandle, just seeing some areas of light precipitation during the day today. And pretty nice, though, over interior Alaska, some sunshine breaking out over Cook Inlet, as well as the central interior areas with just some areas of clouds all the way up to the Arctic coast, winds on the light side, with the exception being Point Hope, Cape Lisburne through the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island, where those gusty northeast winds continue to funnel cold air south and southwestward into the northern Bering Sea. And that'll start to drop the snowfall levels back down to sea level for the southern Bering and Aleutians over the next day. And for tonight, that low tracks northward, so look for rain becoming heavy at times for Kodiak Island, and also increasing wind, gale force winds, and for the North Gulf Coast, possibly increasing to storm force by late tonight, early tomorrow, and also an increase in the winds, rain, and snow for the Panhandle. Areas of light snow possibly into the Copper River Basin, but I don't think anything will get north of the Alaska Range there. So the Tanana Valley, 40-mile country will stay dry, as well as areas to the west and north, but tightening gradients, so the higher elevations will start to see increasing winds. And then for Sunday, snow showers pushing southward across the Bering Sea in toward the Aleutians. Low pressure moves to the Aleutian Range, and that keeps it wet over Bristol Bay. Rain or snow there. Rain diminishing along with the winds for Kodiak Island, but staying wet throughout the day. Storm force winds for the Panhandle, eastern North Gulf Coast areas with, again, rain, snow, possible freezing rain over the inland areas, and mostly dry to the north. A weak trough, though, could bring some light snow showers into the Kobuk-Koyukuk Valley, the Yukon Flats, back down in toward the southwest interior areas. Then for Monday, areas of light snow possible from the Brooks Range and the Kobuk-Koyukuk Valleys across all the western interior, kind of increasing out along the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta into Bristol Bay with that snow, or with that low center, Again, driving the cold air south and southeast now into the eastern Aleutians, so look for snow right down to sea level there, and the same thing for the Alaska Peninsula. Numerous snow showers for the Pribilofs. Rain and snow showers lighter with less wind for the Panhandle, as well as lighter winds, but still kind of unsettled for the North Gulf Coast. Lows tonight, upper 20s northern Panhandle to mid to upper 30s elsewhere. A little below zero for the Copper River Basin, northern Kuskokwim Valley. Otherwise, lows mostly in the 20s and 30s. Followed by highs tomorrow, 30s to near 40. Warmest Seldovia, Homer, Seward, Kodiak. We'll see the warmest temperatures. And also into the lower 40s for portions of the Panhandle. Followed by lows. Again, now above zero for the Copper River Basin, maybe 2 below for Nikolai McGrath. Otherwise, mid to upper 20s, Bristol Bay in the 20s, south central Alaska, 30s to near 40 for the Panhandle. Highs, upper 30s to lower 40s for the southeast coast, near 40 for the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island. Otherwise, 20s to mid 30s, south central Alaska, and up to the north. 5 to 15 below for the central and eastern interior, as well as the Arctic coast and the northern Seward Peninsula to St. Lawrence Island, dropping a shade below zero. Highs tomorrow, 0 to 5 out toward the Bering Strait and the western central Arctic coast. Otherwise, 5 to 20 for the interior areas, followed by lows 5 above to 5 below central interior, a little colder on the Arctic coast and north slope. And that'll be followed by highs, single numbers and teens, most of the interior there, and out to the southwest. Lows right around 10 degrees for the southwest coast, mid-20s for the Pribilofs, lower 30s central western Aleutians, lower to mid-30s for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, followed by highs 35 to 40 for the Fox Islands and the Alaska Peninsula, mostly in the upper 30s for the central Aleutians, near 30 for the Pribilofs, and in the teens for the southwest coast. And then Monday morning lows, single numbers for the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coastal areas, Macoriac, lower 20s for the Pribilofs, followed by highs in the 20s and 30s, teens for the southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And for Sunday morning flying weather, looking like this, some good VFR in the central interior, just about all of the Yukon River Valley areas from the southwest coast, Norton Sound, including Nome, eastward into Norton Bay, and then some marginal VFR there for the Yukon Flats, and from the Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast, areas of IFR and marginal conditions. Bristol Bay, in around Dillingham, and then the north side of the Alaska Peninsula, IFR extends westward to the Pribilofs and northward across St. Matthew Island. Remainder of the Bering Sea and Aleutians, marginal VFR, and a lot of IFR, Kodiak Island, southern Cook Inlet, on up into Prince William Sound, the Copper River Basin, into areas of the Copper River Basin, and all of the Panhandle for the afternoon. Southeast coast improves with marginal VFR, although IFR holding on to the Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area, especially northern portions of those two areas, and then some VFR breaking out from Misty Fjord, Stewart, Hyder. And not bad in the interior. Again, mostly VFR, some isolated marginal VFR now for the Yukon Flats, and over around Eagle, just to the south into the hills there. IFR for the North Slope, eastern Arctic coast, and another band of IFR across St. Matthew Island, the Pribilofs, down into Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, and eastward across the Aleutian Range to Kodiak Island, and then mostly along and on the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range, western Cook Inlet, and then some VFR, northern Cook Inlet into the southern Susitna Valley, IFR for the North Gulf Coast, all the way up into the Talkeetnas and southern Copper River Basin. Monday morning improving there, becoming mostly VFR for the Copper River Basin, still some IFR, western Alaska Range, becoming more widespread across Iliamna Lake, and solid IFR there for Togiak, Bristol Bay, Aleutian Range, Alaska Peninsula, on up into the Yukon Delta, at least the southern Yukon Delta. And some IFR now lifting just northeast of the Pribilofs, but still across St. Matthew Island, marginal VFR St. Lawrence Island. IFR for the central Arctic coast and the eastern Brooks Range. And again, IFR holding for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and from Resurrection Bay eastward to Yakutat and the northern half of the Panhandle. For the afternoon, IFR, southwest coast, northeast Bering Sea, Bristol Bay, and still along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range with that southeast wind flow continuing, and that keeps IFR locked in over Prince William Sound, especially western Prince William Sound, down to the eastern Kenai Peninsula, North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle. All IFR and some IFR in the southern slopes of the central and eastern Brooks Range. Passes, Anativik, and Adigan, both IFR at times throughout the day Sunday. Mostly IFR, especially on the eastern entrances of both Lake Clark and Merrill. Rainy, IFR, especially on the eastern entrance. West side could be VFR. And for windy, occasionally marginal. Isabel will go for IFR, especially on the south side. And Mentesta, occasionally marginal. With Tanita, IFR eastern approach, marginal VFR through the pass and out to the west. Portage, IFR. Chilcoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels at the surface, northern Cook Inlet now into the North Gulf Coast Range and north of the Panhandle, right around Chilcoot and White passes, and north of the Pribilofs with 2,000 feet up to Middleton Island and along the western southeast coast. Icing, a lot of moisture coming up, south-southeast wind flow, both at the surface and aloft. So look for some considerable moderate rime icing into the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, eastern Kenai Peninsula or so, and then quite an area of isolated moderate, lighter icing there, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, much of the southwest interior, all the way out to the entire Aleutian chain. And for the jet stream, south flow 75 to 100 knots, 75 knots Cook Inlet, and 85 knots into the interior, 100 knots approaching the southeast coast from the south and southeast. Pretty light out to the west. Strongest winds at 9,000 feet. Again, eastern North Gulf Coast, 75 knots, and into the Panhandle at the same speed. 3,000 feet, 80 knots southeasterlies there, coming up across the eastern Gulf of Alaska, North Gulf Coast, and 70 knots right off the coast of the Panhandle. Stronger northeasterlies, 40 to 55 knots there. St. Lawrence Island to the northwest Arctic coast. Turbulence, a lot of moderate turbulence there. Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, southern Cook Inlet, Bristol Bay.
You guys got everything tied down back there? Yeah. Yep. We're going through the lee of St. Elias, so there might be some turbulence.
Fasten seatbelt sign on.
Well, who am I to tell you what to do?
There are tens of thousands of glaciers in Alaska. Some stunning cliffhangers, others wide glaciers that come down to meet the ocean tides. Some, like this one we flew over in August, are easily visible from low Earth orbit and are mesmerizing from 1,000 feet above and have trees growing on top of their soil-laden boundaries. Those glaciers, although they represent only a fraction of the world's ice, are contributing much more than their share to sea level rise. Chris Larson and his colleagues have repeatedly measured 220 of them in a small single-engine otter, measuring their height with lasers and their depth with radar, and watching them change from season to season and year to year. But Alaskan glaciers are also different. We're only just figuring out how they all behave. Data from flights like these, part of NASA's Operation Icebridge, can help fill the gaps. Chris and radar specialist Martine Trufer are both from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and both seasoned Alaskan pilots. But they rely on their good friend and legendary bush pilot Paul Kloss and his 35,000 hours in the cockpit to fly the incredibly demanding flight lines the mission requires.
And does it help you guys being pilots too?
I would like to think so, but watching Paul fly and seeing what he does is kind of like trying to learn quantum mechanics in kindergarten.
You know, I can fly my airplane around, but just seeing what Paul does in this extremely challenging environment in the mountains while trying to follow a specific flight line at a specific altitude above ground, negotiating winds, topography, maybe occasional low-level clouds that you have to get around, and just managing all that is just several levels above what I could do as a pilot.
Well, I think the first time I came here to this park, I was probably 4 years old with my father. I've been blessed to be able to fly in lots of places in the world, all over the place, actually, almost every continent. I guess I'm always looking for some place that might be better than this, but I haven't found it.
Paul's plane is about 60 years old and is the first single-engine Otter ever retrofitted with a 1,000 horsepower engine, which makes takeoffs feel effortless and gives Paul the ability to negotiate wild terrain, which he certainly did during the first 2 incredible science flights of this campaign. And with sunny skies and relatively calm air, we covered 3 vastly different pieces of ice. While Paul fueled up the plane, Chris gave us a preview of the day's science and scenery.
So it has one of the greatest coastal reliefs anywhere in the world. So it's between the ocean and the summit of Mount St. Elias, which is 18,008 feet high. It's less than 10 miles. There's a stupendous amount of mountain right off the ocean. It's hard to beat it anywhere in the world. It might be the prettiest for me. It's absolutely stunning. From here in McCarthy, we'll cross one of the bigger precipitation gradients in Alaska, too. Here it's about 10 inches of precipitation a year, and we'll go over to an area where it's on the order of 200 inches per year. So it's from one of the driest parts of Alaska to one of the wettest parts of Alaska in about 45 minutes flight time.
Oh, that's pretty good.
That's awesome. You want to do Tyndall next?
Sure, where you want.
If the winds are calm now, might as well grab it.
First, we came to the rugged landscape of Icy Bay, which not that long ago wasn't a bay at all. It was filled with ice. Tidewater glaciers in this region can make dramatic advances and retreats as they feed on high rates of snowfall and then retreat as they're melted by warm ocean waters. Like the Tyndall Glacier seen here, most of these glaciers have retreated dramatically over the last 100 years. But nearby Yahtzee Glacier, after years of retreat, is currently the most rapidly advancing glacier in Alaska. Overall, though, the Icebridge Alaska surveys, from the Denali region in the north to the Juneau ice field in the southeast, have documented pretty substantial thinning of glacial ice. Areas seen here in orange and red show between about 10 and 15 feet of thinning per year.
There's a nice waterfall up there from the hanging ice.
When we very first started profiling this fall, this gravel fan and the one in the valley next to it didn't exist.
Yeah, I was going to say, look at all the good landing spots here.
Yeah,
There's no place to land here before.
no, it was deep water.
After covering several of Icy Bay's glaciers, given that it was time for lunch, just like that, we landed in this unforgettable spot. Flying eastward, leaving Icy Bay behind, we came to the mighty Malaspina, one of the Earth's great examples of a Piedmont glacier that spills out like pancake batter onto a broad plain as it approaches the sea. It surges at uneven intervals, creating dramatic patterns on its surface, as it distorts the moraines of rock and soil borne along by the glacier. The Malaspina is less dynamic than the Yahtzee and is only melting at about the average rate for Alaska. But that could change quickly.
It has the potential for being one of the bigger geographic evolutions in Alaska. Certainly, my son will be able to witness some big geography changes there. There's potential for it being connected with the ocean through some narrow lagoons, estuaries, which would take a little bit of coastal erosion, but it's not too hard to imagine that where the Malaspina Glacier is now could become a large bay.
The data that Martine's radar provides could reveal how vulnerable the Malaspina is to melting by the nearby ocean. Here we see the radar returns from the surface of the glacier, and here is something that Chris's lasers can't see, the rocky bed of the glacier, giving us both clues as to what's happening under the ice, as well as a measurement of its thickness. Finally, we came to the Yakutat ice field, 300 square miles of absolutely doomed ice perched high in the mountains. Researchers even debate how this ice field came to be at all, since in its current configuration, it's hard to imagine how it could capture enough snow to form glacial ice. And so, even if the Arctic weren't warming faster than the rest of the planet, this area would be likely to melt within a century or two. But with many other glaciers, it's easier to see the connection between a warming planet and ice loss. Thanks to data from IceBridge and other surveys, we now have a good estimate of the current rate of loss from Alaskan glaciers, 75 gigatons a year. While airborne observations over Alaskan glaciers have provided a rich record of change in the area, those efforts are now augmented by NASA's newest ice measuring tool, ICESat-2. With 6 laser beams of its own, and orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes, the satellite will carry on the record of Alaskan change. For their part, Chris and his team will continue to do their surveys for at least the next 2 years, helping to validate the ICESat-2 data and make further detailed observations over the stunning glaciers of Alaska.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Storm warnings for the central and north coast for tomorrow. Southeast winds 50 knots with seas as high as 33 feet, and then high-end gales on the south coast there along Prince of Wales Island and to the west. For southeast winds 45 knots, seas just under 30 feet. Good gales in the forecast for Clarence Strait on Sunday, southeast at 40 knots. And for Stevens Passage, gale warnings, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And for Lynn Canal, north winds 25 knots. Those drop off to 20 knots for Lynn Canal in the northern interchannels on Monday. Still out of the north, and small craft advisories for the central and southern inside water areas for southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the south coast on Monday, south winds 35 to 40 knots, seas around 20 feet. And for the north coast, south to southeast winds at 30 knots. Prince William Sound, gale warnings, east winds 45 knots, seas 12 feet. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, storm warnings, southeast winds 50 knots, seas 26 feet. East winds 25 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and southeast winds 30 knots with 19-foot seas for the Barren Islands. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, east winds 45 knots, gale warnings southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 40. Northern Cook Inlet, north winds 30 knots. And for Monday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 knots. Southeast winds 25 knots for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay. And for the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 20 to 30 knots, seas 18 to 19 feet. And for Prince William Sound, still a pretty brisk east wind at about 30 knots with 6-foot seas. And for Kodiak Island on Sunday, east to southeast winds at 20 knots with 7 to 18-foot seas. For the Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots. Bristol Bay, gale warnings for east winds at 35 knots. And for Monday, the Alaska Peninsula, west to northwesterlies 25 knots. Kodiak Island, south-southeast at 15 to 20. In Bristol Bay, south winds 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, New Year's Day, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Adak and Atka about the same, northwesterlies at 25. And for the Western Aleutians, north winds 25 knots, seas about 12 feet. From Kiska to Shimei on Monday, southeast winds 35 knots, otherwise central and eastern Aleutians all looking at northwest winds 25 to maybe 30 knots with seas running 9 to 13 feet. And for the southwest coast, north winds 30 knots. For the day on Sunday, Norton Sound, north winds 30 knots. Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, north winds at 30 knots. Gale warnings for St. Lawrence Island for north winds at 35 knots. Gales continue for St. Lawrence Island on Monday out of the north at about 35. And for the southwest coast, north to northwesterlies 20 to 25 knots, northwest 25 for the Pribilofs, St. Matthew Island north at 30. Norton Sound winds down to 20 knots still from the north. Eastern Beaufort Sea Coast tomorrow, brisk wind advisories, east winds 20 to 25 knots, lighter winds for the central coast out of the northeast at 15 knots. Then brisk wind advisories again for the western Arctic coast for northeast winds at 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea, northerlies 30 to 35 knots. For Monday, Chukchi Sea, still north winds at 35 knots. And for the central and western Arctic coast, brisk wind advisories, northeast at 25 knots. For the eastern Beaufort Sea coast Monday, gale warnings, east winds 30 to 35 knots. And for tonight again, next system spreads rain into Kodiak Island early this evening, becoming moderate to heavy at times, and heavier precipitation arriving on the North Gulf Coast as well later this evening and throughout the night tonight, trying to push into the Copper River Basin with gale and storm force winds developing for the Panhandle and the North Gulf Coast coming in from the central Gulf of Alaska. Otherwise dry over the interior, no change over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians through Sunday out that way, except colder temperatures coming back down from the north there, bringing the snowfall levels closer to sea level, even for the Aleutians by tomorrow afternoon. Otherwise, storm force winds and rain for the Panhandle and rain and snow for the inside waters. And then for the day on Monday, still wet, but not as windy for southern Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.